Where's the switch for this? Do you know? Is this working? Yes, this down below, right. Okay. Is this working? There is no mic? Okay, that's fine. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alan Truffeisen, and I'm a graduate student member of the organizing committee for this year's Institute on World Affairs. The theme for this year's Institute is Humankind in the 1980s, and on this, the last evening of our symposium, we shall be looking at some issues related to freedom and human rights which will be facing us in the coming decade. Mr. Alexander von Schmeling, the Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany at the Embassy in Washington, D.C., will discuss the threat to personal liberty and security of mounting international terrorism. Dr. David Weisbrot, Professor of International Law at the University of Minnesota, will discuss a different type of threat to personal freedom, that which comes from governments which systematically deny basic human rights to their citizens. Following this evening's presentations, there will be an opportunity for members of the audience to address questions to our two guests. And now I'd like to turn the microphone over to another member of the organizing committee, Lisa Sampson, who will introduce our first speaker.
Von Schmeling. And I'd like to tell you a bit about his diplomatic career, which began in 1955. He was first in Bonn, then in Luxembourg, then to Belgium. He spent 3-year tours in India, then Malaysia, and then Berlin. And he spent 5 years in Portugal, after which he came to Washington, D.C. in '74, has been here ever since as counselor for legal affairs and the consul general. So may I introduce Mr. von Schmeling.
Ladies and gentlemen, two apologies. First, if you don't understand me, tell me. The second is that my relation to the English language is somewhat similar to my relation to my wife. I love her. I sometimes understand her, but I don't master her. So please forgive me. I'm going to speak about challenge of international terrorism. Since January 1970, the United States Air Force recorded nearly 2,000 episodes of international terrorism, not counting acts in Northern Ireland, Israel, and the United States. They included nearly 550 murders, nearly 600 assaults, and about 400 kidnappings. In West Germany, terrorists have to date killed about 30 people. The last one, beginning of this November, a Dutch customs officer. They injured 95 people, attempted to murder 106, and held about 172 people hostages. If terrorism has achieved nothing else in Germany, it has at least created a new rapid growth industry, the bodyguard business. Social scientists used to define acts of terror as deeds born of political desperation. They were supposed to be a last resort, engaged when no other means of political action was possible. Thus, terrorism was supposed to be the ultimate weapon of the oppressed. To define terrorism more in detail is hardly possible. To give you examples of history would be highly dangerous and maybe unwise for a diplomat. I may, however, ask hypothetical questions, undiplomatic questions. Were the freedom fighters against Napoleon, Hitler, and Stalin terrorists? Were your founding father terrorists? Was Begin a terrorist? Could you compare German terrorists with American terrorists, such as Puerto Rican, Cuban, or Croatian terrorists? Or do you have to compare German terrorists with the Weatherman or the Symbionese Liberation Army? everyone here may answer these questions as he wishes. I shall have to limit my answers to the statement that terrorism today is not at all what it was and what it was supposed to be. Terrorism is flourishing in democratic countries where other kinds of political action are abundantly available, and it is not committed by or on behalf of the oppressed. Actually, if the countries in which these deeds are promulgated practiced oppression, the deeds themselves would be easily suppressed. It is because terrorism strikes in countries with constitutional commitments and guarantees for human and civil rights that it poses such a fierce threat. West Germany has been a staging area for terrorist activities for more than 10 years. We can divide the history of terrorism in Germany in 6 phases. You know, every good German, if he defines a problem, goes back to history. No, I do the same. First, the period from 1967 to 1972, in which we witnessed, beginning with the demonstrations against the visit of the Shah of Iran in Berlin, a constant increase in terrorist activities, an increase in quantity and in quality. This period ended with the capture of the guiding elite of terrorism of their time, people like Andreas Bader, Holger Mainz, Jan Karl Raspe, Gudrun Enslin, and finally Ulrike Meinhof in June 1972. Extensive preparations for criminal trials began, the population relaxed. Second period. Short time of relative calm followed, but was abruptly ended later that year by the Palestinian murder of Israeli athletes participating in the Munich Olympic Games. This tragic incident, though not caused by German terrorists, can be looked upon as the catalytic event as to mobilizing the population in support of stronger measures to be taken by the government. Third period. From this event onwards, a distinctive action-reaction cycle was initiated between terrorist activities and government counteractions. The terrorists increased their activities. The government adopted legislation to counter the terrorist threat and reorganized the police force. This development culminated in the attack on the German embassy in Stockholm on April 24, 1975. Fourth period, a period of relative quietness followed from April 1975 to the beginning of 1977, which could be seen as a phase of regeneration and planning on the terrorist side. Fifth, after the murder of the Federal Prosecutor General Siegfried Buback and his driver on April 7, 1977 in Karlsruhe, and the murder of the chairman of the board of the Dresdner Bank, one of the biggest and most influential banks in Germany, Jürgen Ponto, on July 30, 1977, in Hessen. A decade of violence and terror culminated with the kidnapping and subsequent murder of industrialist Hans Schleyer. Before the Schleyer affair was over, 4 innocent people lay dead in the streets of Cologne. A Lufthansa airliner had been kidnapped to Mogadishu on October the 13th of that same year in Palma de Mallorca. The pilot of the airliner killed and its passengers held hostage in an attempt to blackmail the West German government into freeing other imprisoned terrorists. Since October 1977, we witness again a period of relative quietness, which most probably is again a period of regeneration and planning. This time, however, our judicial system and our police is better equipped and has been much more successful in tracking down terrorism. We are not sure when this rather quiet period will end, but we are now better prepared to meet the challenge of terrorism. Terrorism is not dead, as shown by the recent shootout at the Dutch-German border and by the attack on the Frankfurt bureau of the German press agency, which, by the way, in the beginning seemed to prove the first American involvement in German terrorism. Among the 11 terrorists who had been arrested after that attack was a black American. However, the German police had to release this man immediately because it was found out that this man was involved in a free fight in a nearby brothel and just fled after being beaten. And he saw these 10 terrorists fleeing in the road, and he just joined them. So he was just a terrorist by accident. What do such kidnappings, hijackings, and murder signify? Who are the people behind them? Why are they happening in Germany? To begin to answer these questions, we have to turn back to the student protest, again, history, and extra-parliamentary opposition, APO movements of the 60s, which opposed an outdated and authoritarian system of higher education. Also, the American involvement in Vietnam and the popular Springer Press, a group of newspapers which they considered reactionary. The student protest movement in Germany undoubtedly was inspired by movements here in the United States, originating particularly in Berkeley, California. It later projected Latin American conditions to Europe and present social and political abuses in a highly distorted and exaggerated way. Though it is not the national offspring of these movements, the Red Army faction, as it is called now, also known as the Baader-Meinhof gang, has its roots in the unrest of the 60s. But the bulk of the students who marched in protest against Vietnam are now, like their counterparts in the United States, integrated and valuable members of German society. Many of them have achieved a comfortable affluency. So we return to our basic question, who then are the terrorists? 10 years ago, the Information Center of the German Embassy issued a position paper on the student revolution in West Germany that subsequently became an official document of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. In that paper, we predicted the militant among the students may well try to carry on their future activity with new political issues in an even bolder manner. If their violence increases, they will probably lose the bulk of their student followers and end up in isolation. This is indeed what happened. As the bulk of the student protesters was absorbed into the mainstream of German society, they left behind them ever smaller, isolated groups, alienated people who had developed remarkable skills in staging protest actions inside and outside of universities. Now doubly alienated from society and from their original organizations, these people would find more spectacular ways to unsettle the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie because in some vaguely Marxist way they imagined themselves engaged in a struggle against the bourgeoisie on behalf of the working class, even though the working class wanted nothing to do with them. From the beginning, the workers refused to join the so-called Krawalle, and they are today its most adamant opponents. American withdrawal from Vietnam was the avowed goal of the student demonstrations in the 60s, the Vietnam War being perceived as an act of imperialism. But there were other less overt goals within the student protest movement. Small groups were developing action programs designed to thrust what they perceived as a fat and uninspired society into the equivalent of Third World Warfare. These two goals are not the same. The one wants the end of a war, and the other wants to spread that war to other parts of the world, many Vietnams. In May 1967, leaflets glorifying a disastrous fire in a Brussels department store, which had claimed the lives of 251 people, appeared in Berlin. The pamphlet referred to the Brussels fire as a new form of demonstration, a great event for Vietnam demonstrators. A burning department store, it argued, with burning people for the first time gives the European metropolis the crackling sensation of Vietnam, something we have so far missed in Berlin. Burn, warehouse, burn. Less than a year later, 2 department stores in Frankfurt were set afire. The Frankfurt fires were the curtain risers for an unfolding drama of violence. They were the first joint ventures of Andreas Baader and Gudrun Enslin, two leaders of what came to be known in 1971 as the Baader-Meinhof Gang. Another member, Ulrike Meinhof, was still part of the literary establishment, member of an affluent Salon Bolshevik subculture. In her weekly publication Konkret, she was providing theory, rationale, and justification for the acts of arson. Meinhof eventually went underground in 1970. She surfaced once as a participant in a shooting spree which freed Andreas Baader from Berlin prison and left an elderly librarian paralyzed for life. There is speculation, but no clear knowledge about the roles of the leaders of the Red Army faction. It has been claimed that Andreas Baader, who had no academic training, injected the idea of violence into the movement. A witness would later testify there was an air of conspiracy about Baader. He really sent us on a trip. Crime became political action. The Red Army faction, grown out of the Baader-Meinhof Gang, though the largest and most influential, most active, and best organized group, is by far not the only terrorist group we have in Germany. There were and are a number of other small, very often ad hoc groups, which often carried very militarily belligerent or fantastic romantic names. And there were and are a few other more important groups like the movement June the 2nd, which was particularly active in Berlin from 1972 to 1975, the Socialist Patient Collective of Heidelberg, to which some of the terrorists belonged, who later took part in the attack on the German embassy in Stockholm, and finally, since March 1975, the so-called revolutionary cells. It's difficult to ascertain to what extent these organizations were and are interrelated and to what degree individuals belonged or belong to one or more of those groups. Terrorist groups do not report their membership list to registered officers. It is generally believed, however, that the leaders of the Baader-Meinhof Gang, Red Army faction, directed or strongly influenced the activities of many of the other organizations. In retrospect, the patience of German authorities towards these young people was amazing. While awaiting appeal of their arson conviction, Andreas Baader and Gudrun Enslin were entrusted with setting up a new model rehabilitation center in Frankfurt. Later it was learned that they used the center to recruit new talent into the movement. Long before Vietnam was over, Third World themes began to appear among the Red Army faction goals. We don't know whether theory preceded action or vice versa. Whether, for example, embracing the Palestinian cause preceded the interaction with extremist Arab groups who were already using terror tactics. We do know that as early as 1970, German terrorists were traveling to the Middle East for training, weapons, and other support, learning about guerrilla warfare and drawing, vastly from the textbooks of Latin American urban guerrillas, particularly from the manual of the Brazilian Marighella. We also do not know when exactly the terrorist network expanded to include Japanese Red Army and Latin American terrorists. Perhaps as early as 1972, but we do know that in 1975, the attack on the OPEC meeting in Vienna resulted from a coordinated effect of terrorists from all over the world. We also know by the identical plans to kidnap Schleyer and Moro that a close cooperation exists between Italy's Red Brigades and Germany's Baader-Meinhof faction, a sort of operational cooperation, as it is called by the Red Brigades. Although there is cooperation between terrorist groups all over the world, the Baader-Meinhof Gang in Germany, the Red Brigades in Italy, the IRA in North Ireland, groups in Sweden, Holland, France, Spain, Switzerland, Austria, Greece, Turkey, Palestinians, the Japanese Red Army, the Argentine Montoneros, the Uruguayan Tupamaros, and whatnot, there does not yet seem to be a unified high command. In effect, that is what particularly the Italian Red Brigades are proposing. We know, however, of certain command centers. The HQ of the ultra-left Palestine groups led by George Habash or Wadia Haddad, and the office of the Venezuelan Ilyich Ramirez Sanchez, or better known as Carlos the Jackal in Paris. Periodic summit meetings have helped the multinational work of the terrorists. The first was in terrorist summit meeting in Lebanon in 1972, the latest in Larnaca in Cyprus in 1977. Both were sponsored and financed by the Palestinians and attended by Germans, Japanese, Iranians, Turks, and the IRA. We also know that terrorists all over the world are supported by and trained in certain countries, and these countries are not only Algeria, Libya, South Yemen, Iraq, and Cuba. As the German movement aged, the theories that supported it in its early years disappeared. Goals like revolutionizing the world and making it more just and equitable were also swallowed up into anarchy. Recently, even the idea of destroying society has given way to activities aimed at freeing imprisoned colleagues. A younger group or third generation of terrorists has begun to take over the movement. Men like Klar and women like Albrecht, Brigitte Mohnhaupt, Gabriele Kröcher-Tiedemann, as well as Willi Stoll until his death, were and are now the leading figures of the German section of the international terrorist underground. We believe that the present leader is, again, a lady, Brigitte Mohnhaupt. No known revolutionary theory is attributed to these people. They appear to be mercenaries of violence without concept or conviction. Action for its own sake seems to be their raison d'etre and modus operandi. The movement's international scope saved these people from arrest. Only 2 terrorists were apprehended between the murder of Schleyer and April this year. Since May of this year, however, German authorities have been quite successful in tracking down and arresting a number of terrorists, and I should say that out of the most wanted 46 terrorists, about half of them are now in prison, or were in prison. 3 of them are one of them is in Holland, one of them is in the United States, one is in France, but 4 of them unfortunately had been in Yugoslavia. Now, the remaining terrorists are still at large in Europe. In Germany, they found refuge either in neighboring Western European countries, the Middle East, or perhaps in Latin America. As I said before, we are at present living in a period of probable regeneration and planning of the terrorists. During the last few weeks, 16 suspected terrorists have gone underground and disappeared. We believe that this is the 6th recruiting action of the Red Army faction, and that they probably prepare a spectacular action for which they have to refill their cadres. How many homegrown terrorists do we have? On November 14, 1977, our Minister of Justice, Dr. Hans-Jochen Vogel, stated that from 1970 to date, there have been 182 final convictions and 52 sentences of first instance against terrorists. 113 persons have been indicted, and about 550 suspects are under preliminary investigation. 98 persons are under custody awaiting trial. There are finally 49 warrants of arrest. According to these figures, the total number of convicted or suspected known German terrorists is about 1,050. Clearly, the numbers are not large. Still, they pose an extraordinary challenge to the liberal democratic state. Now, consider the position of West Germany. The agony of the Third Reich is recent, and a communist German state a neighbor. But we in West Germany have forged a democracy, and we are maintaining a stable and affluent society. At the onset of violence in the late 60s, police powers were sharply circumscribed. Our entire legal system had been made into a model of liberalism. The authoritarianism of Imperial Germany had been slowly changing into a more liberal system of when World War I broke out. The clearly liberal system of the Weimar Republic from 1919 to 1933 was smashed by the repression of the Third Reich, which again had given way to a constitution which guaranteed human rights and embodied a far-reaching reform of our criminal code. In liberalizing criminal proceedings, we felt a need to install every possible safeguard against arbitrariness, to conceive in advance of every possible injustice. We, of course, did not conceive of terrorism. Thus, criticism of the state in West Germany is not only legitimate, it is even sort of therapeutic. People have the right to complain, to take their complaints to the courts, to make their appeals to the public at large, and to participate in demonstrations. Freedom of expression is guaranteed, and it permits groups to influence public opinion, while freedom of assembly paves the way for the formation of groups dedicated to change. A convicted person can appeal his conviction to ever higher courts, right up to the Federal Constitutional Court, or even to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Wherever legal means are provided for redress, there is a society of law, and the underlying assumption is that the law will prevail. A majority vote in Parliament is necessary for new legislation, and a 2/3 parliamentary majority is needed to change the Constitution. With such cautious legal means provided for change and redress, terrorism, with its use of criminal tactics to achieve change, raises many basic questions about the effectiveness of law and strikes at the underlying assumptions in the democratic state. As you may well imagine, there is a heightened sensitivity in West Germany as to how far the state should go to protect its citizens if the price is a lessening of civil liberties. By design, police powers are limited, and these limitations make for a certain amount of inefficiency. What would happen to do we want to make the police more powerful and thus more efficient? What, in this case, would happen to civil liberties? And if we do infringe upon civil liberties, will we be moving toward that fascist state that the terrorists seek to provoke, in order that they may have the privilege of overthrowing it? Conservatives, on the other hand, feel that chaos is the real enemy, precisely that chaos which the terrorists also can provoke. Either way, increased police powers or chaos, because the police do not have the power to act, can destroy the democratic state. Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, amongst others, has spoken out against the danger of overreaction. But there is danger also in underreaction. We Germans have learned from the past. The Weimar Republic reminds us what the consequences of acquiescence to terrorism can be. Nevertheless, there is a persistent kind of liberalism in Western Europe that is sensitive exclusively to the dangers of an erosion of civil liberties, but is peculiarly phlegmatic about threats to liberty by enemies of the state. It is blind to the sufferings of fear and oppression, if fear and oppression are caused by organizations other than the state. It does not acknowledge that there are cases in which the state must be given sufficient powers to protect citizens from infringements upon their civil liberties by criminal organizations. I said at the outset that terrorism is flourishing in democratic countries, and the reasons now become apparent. A democratic, industrialized society is particularly vulnerable to terrorist activity, and, if apprehended, the terrorists can count on being accorded every protection of the law. Thus, when our homegrown terrorists were apprehended, they were granted reasonable bail and relatively easy appeal. Actually, they found a powerful ally in our legal system. According to the September 19, 1977 issue of Time magazine, a cadre of 70 or so clever young radical lawyers, there are 31,000 lawyers practicing in Germany, had pushed the system to its libertarian limits. They are not only the terrorists' best friends, but also the worst enemies of the courts. These lawyers have mastered the art of disrupting cases with obfuscating rhetoric, demands for evidence that is impossible to secure, requests for delays, lacking any provisions for contempt of court. German judges have generally been powerless to control these lawyers. Using the privileged status of the attorney-client relationship as a cloak, about a dozen of these lawyers have served illegally as liaison between imprisoned terrorists and their colleagues still at large. In the past 2 years, for example, there were 12,644 visits to 12 imprisoned terrorists by attorneys who brought with them 60,000 pieces of mail to 12 terrorists. Authorities are convinced that on such consultative visits, the lawyers carry messages from one terrorist group to another, coordinate hunger strikes, and develop plans for future terrorist attacks. We, by the way, have now in a very recent trial in Germany the proof that the weapons which have been brought into Stammheim, by which 3 of our terrorists committed suicide, have been brought in by lawyers. As time went on, measures were adopted to make the legal system less vulnerable to terrorists. In 1971, laws had been amended dealing with attacks on airplanes and with hostage-taking, and up till now we have had changes of laws to be more able to face terrorist threats. And in 1976, the Federal Republic of Germany introduced a resolution in the United Nations against the taking of hostages. This led to setting up an ad hoc committee, which is now, as it is the case in the United Nations, drawing up proposals. It will take some years, but we hope that we will be able one day to have a convention against hostage takers and a possibility either to extradite them to a country that will bring them to justice or to bring them to justice in their own country. International cooperation is making hijacking a high-risk enterprise with ever-diminishing returns, and Mogadishu was last year's outstanding example for this. The proposed United Nations Convention against taking of hostages, though restricted to hostage situations, is somewhat similar to the recent European Convention against Terrorism, the so-called 1977 Strasbourg Convention. There are 5 other international conventions covering the subject of international terrorism: the Tokyo Convention on Offenses and certain other acts committed on board aircraft, the Hague Convention for the suppression of unlawful seizure of aircraft, the Montreal Convention for the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of civil aircraft, and finally the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against Internationally Protected Persons. Finally, the Anti-Terrorist Declaration of 7 leaders of state or government, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and United States, made in Bonn on July the 17th, 1977, should also be mentioned, and also a declaration of the Political Committee of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe of December the 4th this year, which also deals with terrorism. International terrorism irresistibly invites international counterterrorism, which is proven by the recent extraordinary turn of events in Europe in tracking down terrorists. Cooperation in the academic and in the law enforcement fields is also growing. Just 3 weeks ago, we witnessed an important international conference in Berlin. The 64 participants, mainly from Germany and the United States, dealt with the psychology of terrorism, the socio-cultural determinations, the attitude of the population towards terrorism, the possibilities of fighting terrorism, and also with the diverse ideologies and forms of international terrorism. Thus, legislation within affected countries combined with international cooperation are the vehicles by which nations have chosen to defend themselves against terrorism. West Germany is trying to cope with it within the framework of a constitutional democracy, and we are painfully aware that the choice between fear and chaos on the one hand and too much police power on the other is the choice between the rock and the hard place. Our actions are therefore cautious and, we hope, wise. This is not only our opinion. To underline my statement, I should like to quote the concluding remarks of Major John D. Elliott from the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Department of the Army, of his prepared statement in the hearing before the Senate Subcommittee on Criminal Laws and Procedures on April 26, 1978, concerning terrorists in Germany, a statement which was endorsed later on by Senator Strom-Thurmond presiding. As we contemplate how to respond within the rule of law to terrorist attacks, we can take considerable encouragement from Bonn's example. It is obvious that the battle has not been won, but the Germans are in an excellent position to continue the struggle while the terrorists have been weakened significantly. It is evident that the terrorists expected Bonn to overreact to their attacks and begin a series of increasingly repressive measures that would drive the population to the arms of the terrorists. Exactly the opposite has occurred. Bonn has reacted cautiously to the threat and consistently outmaneuvered terrorists in the battle for the public consciousness. The government has structured its legal adaptations precisely to counter terrorism and broaden the population's support for its actions by keeping them informed while soliciting their assistance. All societies are vulnerable to terrorism, and it is unfortunate that the reaction of some has been so repressive that democracy has disappeared as a form of government altogether. This is not the case in West Germany. What some consider as strict reductions of civil liberties are better interpreted as legal adjustments necessary to cope with unique features of a modern societal threat. Nothing is accomplished by pessimists who argue that anti-terrorist legislation will be subverted for other purposes. This is nonsense, and there is no evidence to support such allegations. Bonn is the strongest democracy in Europe, and we can all be comforted by its successful defense of the democratic process of government. Nothing should be clearer today than the fact that Bonn is not Weimar. That's not from me, it's from an American. Now, for the most intriguing questions. Who becomes a terrorist? Why does somebody become a terrorist? What social, psychological forces are at play? And finally, how does one deal with a terrorist? The answer to the first question is that our terrorists have been, for the most part, well-educated offspring of the bourgeoisie. Out of the 44 most wanted terrorists, 23 have studied at universities, and only 4 are real blue-collar workers. Incidentally, 25 were female and only 19 were male, whereby the women generally were more brutal in terrorist attacks and more prepared to fight, a phenomenon which would be worthwhile study. Why do they become terrorists? As I made clear at the beginning, they are not oppressed, nor do they represent an oppressed class, nor are they driven to terrorism out of the desperation born of oppression. The prevalent rationale holds that the pursuit of affluence in West Germany, the focus on materialism and or the consumerist society affects families in such a way that the young are propelled into radical movements. In the United States, a similar kind of theory explains the embrace by the young of religious, spiritual, or mystical movements, a phenomenon which, by the way, we can also witness in Germany, though at a lesser extent. While it is easier to understand how the absence of spirituality can propel someone toward it, it is more difficult to see a connection between materialism and terrorism. Another view holds that while Italy's Red Brigades are reacting to a society that is too stratified and bureaucratized to meet their expectations, Germany's Red Army faction represents a generation made cynical and even suicidal by capitalist society, the Cold War, in Germany's recent history. Recently, I heard a lecture by a German professor in Washington who felt every reason to believe that terrorism is an incurable illness, for which he even coined the term monoperceptosis. According to this professor, quite a number of persons follow overvalued ideas. These ideas can be positive, as in the case of overzealous detective. They can be neutral, as in the case of a stamp collector, or they can be negative, as in the case of a terrorist. One of the causes for their illness may be found in a distorted father image, in which the father may be equalized with or replaced by the state, a state which in the mind of German terrorists is a capitalist state dominated by foreign governments, in particular by the CIA. Monoperceptosis manifests itself in a form of delusion, in losing reality, in an infantile feeling of omnipotence, in a narrowing and a change of conscience. That may all be so. However, I do not follow the professor when he says that this illness is incurable. Luckily, not all terrorists are terrorists for life. We have a number of German terrorists who, though still leaning heavily to the left and demanding social changes, have apparently renounced their belief in violence. Attorney Horst Mahler is the most prominent example, and others are Baumann and Klein, and perhaps even Miss Paul and maybe Miss Burster. And you, of course, here in America, you have similar changes from terrorism to law-abiding and good American citizens. I recently met Elrich Klever, who is really a person who has found back to America. Every psychosociological explanation of terrorist behavior is probably somewhat true, but no explanation suffices. We are left with speculation. The only certainty we have is that in some vague way, terrorists assume that whatever will replace a bombed-out capitalism will be better, even though they must surely know that they will not be the ones to govern the replacement. We do, however, know something about how one gets to be a terrorist. The careers of apprehended terrorists all reveal a discouragingly similar pattern, a progression from a prominent role in public nuisances to violent demonstrations, to subversive conspiracy, and finally, terrorism. We suspect, too, that sympathizers are being constantly recruited into the terrorist underground. We know that an essential prerequisite for an effective fight of terrorism, which starts at its roots, is research of its spiritual and social origin and motives. This is done today in an ever-increasing way. You may even say that the study of terrorism has become very fashionable. I also try to give you some ideas of an assessment of the situation in Germany. On the other hand, we should not underestimate the operational side. I myself am not a police officer. Allow me, therefore, in concluding, to say only a few words on the care and handling of terrorists by quoting the following hints on dealing with terrorists, which have been suggested by the Irish writer and politician Conor Cries O'Brien. Convincing the terrorist that he is not going to get his own way. That involves refusal to talk to him, since though he can argue fluently from his own peculiar premises, he is not accessible to rational argument based on premises other than his own. This reminds me somewhat on the discussions we had in the early 50s with communist Germans from the other side who had been trained in dialectic materialism and who are also in the same way as terrorists not able to argue in the same logical form as we are used to. Now again, O'Brien, depriving him as far as possible of the publicity he is so avidly seeking. Publicity is very important to terrorists. In the so-called Kröcher Manual, found in Sweden after the attack on the German embassy, there is a whole chapter devoted to the use of radio and TV. Some time ago, the terrorists managed to broadcast for some minutes on the wavelengths of the biggest German radio network. The recent attack on the Frankfurt DPA office was also mainly motivated by their desire to gain publicity. Finally, a refusal to be impressed, confused, or diverted by the versatility of his propaganda campaign, unremitting but not unrestrained or indiscriminate pressure by the security forces, and support for these forces by the public. 40 minutes. Thank you very much indeed.
I would like to thank Mr. von Schmeling for his talk, and I remind the audience that following the second presentation, there will be a short time for questions. I'd now like to present our second speaker. Dr. David Weisbrod received the AB degree with honors from Columbia University and a law degree from the University of California at Berkeley. He is currently professor of international law at the University of Minnesota, vice chair of Amnesty International USA, and vice chair of the International Human Rights Committee of the American Bar Association. But I think I can safely say that he will be speaking tonight as an individual and not as a representative of one of these organizations. Professor Weisbrod will attempt to draw possible connections between the issues of terrorism and human rights, and will also discuss the nature of human rights. Will you please welcome Dr. David Weisbrod.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. I should say that I don't usually consider myself a doctor. I guess I do have a Juris Doctor degree, but most of the time I spend in class teaching my law students how to sue doctors, and they don't like, so they don't like me to use that term very much. Looking over the schedule of this last week's speeches, of which there were several on terrorism, and listening this evening, I felt very much the need to perhaps restore a little bit of what I thought perhaps might be balanced in the presentation in the few minutes I have to talk with you. It's not that I'm unconcerned about terrorism. I think it is a considerable problem, but I think it has to be placed in perspective, and I guess I start, like my colleague, in history and in the place in where the term terrorism began. It began, as far as I've been able to determine, in the Reign of Terror in the 18th century in France. And the term was coined for what the government was doing to its citizens, rather than what non-governmental groups were doing. And so terrorism must be seen in the context of political violence by all parties to the society, and not merely by the non-governmental groups that one might hear about, the Baader-Meinhof group or the Red Brigade. Under this original meaning of the word, one has to become concerned about terrorism in Argentina, in the sense that the government and non-governmental groups imprison thousands, kidnap, torture, and one must see it as a whole. I think there's far more violence done by governments than by non-governmental groups, including these terrorist organizations that we've been hearing about. Let's look at a few statistics. There are 10,000 prisoners political prisoners in the Soviet Union, probably around 50,000 who've been imprisoned without trial in Indonesia for as many as 12 to 15 years. There are 1,500 in Chile who've disappeared without a trace, mostly we think because of government conduct. Compare that to the statistics that Mr. von Schmeling gave us of 2,000 incidents of terrorism in the world since 1970. 550 killed. I think he was moving very fast at that point, but I think it was 600 wounded and 400 kidnapped. That's a very small number for the tremendous emphasis that is placed on terrorism. I think we have to compare it also to violence in our own society, the violence that we know, criminal violence. Compare, for example, in each year, 10,000 murders, 90,000 assaults, 13,000 suicides. One can get a feel, and that's in the United States alone, rather than those worldwide statistics I gave, or I borrowed from Mr. von Schmeling. My data was a little bit smaller than his, so I decided to try to be fair and give his data. But you can get a feel for the kind of importance that we're talking about, and as to terrorism, when one looks at that kind of those kind of statistics. I think, for me, terrorism has become a part. This whole worry about terrorism has become a part of a climate of fear that we're told to be worried about, and that can be used, unfortunately, to make it possible to brutalize society and to make it more unfair. As to terrorism, I'm concerned about the prices we have to pay to respond to the terrorist concern. I don't like the loss of privacy when I'm searched in the airports before I come down here to Ames. It's a price I'm willing to pay, but I recognize it as a price. I don't like it when I see in European airports Army officers with submachine guns in open sight all the time. It's maybe another price I'm willing to pay, but I know it is a price. There is a European government which forbids employment of government employees as teachers or even garbage collectors if there is a, quote, reasonable doubt whether a person supports any organization or any party which opposes the Constitution, and I quote. Now, the burden is placed on the clerk or the secretary to prove their loyalty. Does that sound familiar? It's the laws that we had to live with, unfortunately, in the McCarthy era here in the United States. And they're explained, and I can understand thoroughly why Strom Thurmond thinks that the Germans may have the answer. When they cite measures like that, that's another price that we have to pay. Terrorism is what Uruguay argues when it imprisons one out of every 50 of its citizens in the last few years. 1 out of every 50 citizens in Uruguay has been imprisoned in the last couple of years. And they're still going to prison, even though I forget the name of the terrorist group down there, has been obliterated by military action largely. As a lawyer, and I may sound a little like special pleading, but I worry when actions are taken against attorneys, partially because I am one, and I plead guilty, but also because they're the ones who have to defend our rights. And if they are attacked, then you have to really worry about it. Now, there is a European country in which the mere suspicion that the attorney shares the views of of his clients or her clients will mean that that attorney can be thrown out of the case. They don't have to show that they're carrying guns or anything else. They're just the mere suspicion. And the way they prove it is by citing that the attorney calls his client by the familiar pronoun you. You're familiar in French, for example. It's tu if you're a friend and vous if you're a little bit more distant. And there are similar distinctions in many European languages, and we don't have it in English, I think, thank goodness. But because they call their clients tu or du, one all of a sudden becomes at party with one's clients and therefore is removed from the case. Now, I'm not entirely familiar with the situation in all those cases, but at least it's ground for concern and worry. Terrorism causes repression, and repression may cause more terrorism. And it's that spiral of mutual tyranny in which most of us are forced to, in a place of fear and loss of freedom and powerlessness. And I haven't really come here to talk about terrorism, but I felt that, and I'm not an expert in the subject, but I think that there may be other responses to both repression and to the tyranny of terrorism that one must consider. I must say I feel a certain amount of helplessness when I listen to talks like given by Mr. von Schmeling, of feeling of, well, I'm not a diplomat, and I'm not a police officer, and even though I graduated from Berkeley, I don't think I'm a terrorist. But I want to do something in the area, and at least one area in which I think you can do something is to be concerned about human rights. It may be another response to government repression, perhaps one that doesn't use terrorist means. In talking about that, and I guess I should be very brief, let me give you a concrete case, and that's of a friend of mine, actually, a young woman by the name of Gwen Loken. She lives down in, she lives about 2-3 blocks from my house and goes to a Lutheran church only half a block from my house. And she fell in love with an Argentinian young fellow by the name of Horacio Lopez. And they got married, and he went down to Argentina, and the both of them together. And she learned Spanish and made friends. And then there was a military coup in Argentina in March of 1976. And she and many of her friends were concerned that the democratically elected government in Argentina was thrown out and the military government had replaced it. And she and her friends began distributing leaflets, and of course those were against the law. You couldn't call for democratically elected government in that country by means of leaflets or speaking in public. And what she did was she put leaflets on a bench next to a bus stop, and she was hoping that people would pick the leaflets up. And then she got on the bus herself, leaving the leaflets there. Apparently somebody saw her because the bus hadn't gone but about 5 blocks before the bus was stopped, and 5 armed men, some in uniform, some not, got in the bus. They went to the back of the bus where she was sitting. They dragged her by the hair down the steps of the bus and out of the bus. They took her to the provincial police station. They stripped her. They threw water on her. They took electric prods and shocked her. They took a gun and put it up to her head and blindfolded her. And she heard a ring of a gunshot, but she had only been subjected to a mock execution. She was tortured essentially for 5 days, and this is experience in this field is that your danger of being tortured only comes during the first few days after your arrest, which makes one concerned about laws such as there is in a European country in which one can be kept for 30 days incommunicado without being able to communicate with one's lawyer, with one's friends, with anyone. But returning to Argentina, her husband, who was a law student or just graduated from law school, and therefore I have lots of sympathy for him because that's like my student, went to the police station and asked, it was almost his first case out of law school, he went to the police station and asked whether they knew of anything about his wife. And they said no, and came back a second time, and a friendly police officer said, you better not come back or you're going to be in trouble. His third visit resulted in his being arrested. For me, the most worrisome point or disturbing point in her history in prison was the moment when she was looking down the hallway and she saw that her last best chance of release was that is her husband had been also arrested, and so they were both in prison. At that time, or just about that time, her parents got a call from the Associated Press saying, "We understand that your daughter has been arrested in Argentina." That was their first notice. What is your comments? And at this point, I think I'd like to stop and ask you to think about the question: what would you do in that situation? How would you respond if that was your sister, or if that was your daughter? What would you do?
Become a terrorist.
Well,
I'd fly down to see what I could do.
okay, that's a
I do
possibility.
some kneecapping.
Yeah.
I am a Chilean, and I was kidnapped by the secret police in my camp. I was in a camp, Villa Grimaldi, for 33 days. I wasn't tortured by the secret police. I had disappeared my sister, 21-year-old, her husband, her brother-in-law, her father-in-law, 4 relatives kidnapping by the secret police in my camp. I saw so many things in my camp. 2,500 people disappeared. And I tell you what we do for find my sister. I've been talking all over this country. I've been talking to also United Nations. And I was talking in Chicago about my sister. We are still looking for her. My mother in Chile, she was 17 days in hungry strike. And the government promised to United Nations give answer to us about our relative and give answer about 670 people. They promised that after the hungry strike end, but we still don't have any answer for that. That we do for find the people.
I'm very
We
moved
still fight for that.
by your statement. Indeed, that was the kind of things, to a certain extent, that her parents did. Does anyone else have any suggestions about things that could be done in that context, or particularly in Gwen's context? Because I think that Gwen's case may speak to all of us.
Could she go to the State Department and get that to work?
They did, in fact, try the State Department, and that was the bad old days of Kissinger, and they weren't very interested. Can you imagine why that was, why Kissinger might not have been, or the State Department wasn't particularly interested in helping this U.S. citizen imprisoned in Argentina?
Well, if our government had friendly relations with the government in Argentina, they wouldn't want to oppose them.
Indeed, and there's the Ford factories in Argentina that they expressed. And there was also the concern that the Argentine government had been making little had been making little discussions with the Russians, and that they was concerned that if we began to push on certain issues like that, that might push the Argentine government in that direction. So good relations is precisely what one is concerned about. Any other suggestions?
I understand that the group Amnesty International is active in that area, and they might be able to get some information.
Indeed, that's what her parents did. They called Don Fraser, who was their congressman in Minneapolis. And Don was able to go to the organization, to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, who happened to be an Argentinian, a former Argentine ambassador to the United States. He was, of course, concerned about the image of his country in this country. And we don't know for sure what the causal effects were, but a few days after Don Fraser's call to the OAS, there was Gwen was put on a plane and returned to the United States, which left Horacio still in prison. And essentially what Gwen did was precisely what this gentleman in the green sweater from Chile did, and that is to go around and talk and get people to write letters, hundreds of letters, thousands of letters on behalf of Horacio. And they tried the OAS again, but that didn't work too well. We did file a petition in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the OAS, but those procedures grind very slowly. And they did work with Amnesty International, and ultimately he was released. And one doesn't know the causal connection. Again, it may have been the combined pressure. In the human rights field, one often has to deal with a strange form of causation. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who did his military service in Minneapolis, and during his whole military service he spent spotting planes up in the sky like this, and you just sort of kid him, what a silly thing to have done during World War II. He said, no, but it was very important. I was successful. No planes came. And that's the kind of causation that one unfortunately has to often deal with. But the other things that Gwen's case demonstrates is, first, it demonstrates that governments are not always, although they sometimes are, very effective in working for their citizens in regard to human rights. They have a role to play, and indeed I was here 2 years ago and talked a little bit about the role of governments. That intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations, like the Organization of American States, can have an important role to play in this regard. But ultimately, individuals may have a role in helping to bring pressure to bear on governments through letters, through publicity, to try to get human rights in situations like Gwen's and Horacio's. Now, I would like to say a few words about the work of Amnesty International, not because I represent it here, but because I think it demonstrates a little bit about what human beings can do, what we can do, and about situations in which there are human rights violations, in which there is state terrorism, if you wish. AI is an organization which makes use of the sensitivity of governments to their own image. I don't fully understand why governments are sensitive about their image in regard to human rights, but they are. And it's sort of counterintuitive, if you wish. I mean, one doesn't expect it. But they're terribly sensitive to criticism in the world community, and particularly where the finger of an organization with some credibility is pointed in guilt at that country. I think another thing is that diplomats don't particularly like to be criticized and to have their countries criticized, and they're very sensitive. And what Amnesty International functions as is somewhat like, it's just a group of people like us, but it functions somewhat like an ombudsman. And I don't mean an older Swedish gentleman with gray hair and a beard, but I mean a means of communication between the individual in prison and the highest levels of one's government. And it uses, because the letters go to the highest levels of the government, saying there's somebody in your prisons. And the government official may not want to know or may not know, in fact, what is going on in his or her prison. And it goes through a means, through a technique which is that of a diplomat who is very sensitive of the international standards that are applicable in the human rights field. And the principal standard in this regard are something called the Human Rights Covenants. They're two treaties, two multilateral treaties, which define what human rights are. They're what you write about when you write to the government. What Jimmy Carter means when he's talking about human rights. They ultimately define the concept. And there are two treaties that describe all the human rights, the right to be free from torture, the right to be free from arbitrary imprisonment. And Amnesty International essentially makes use of these documents by taking a group of people in London, a research department and a staff, relatively small staff of about 125, and researching these cases and finding out whether there are people who qualify as prisoners of conscience. And Amnesty International defines prisoners of conscience in a very limited way. Those who have been imprisoned for reasons of race, religion, politics, or language, and who have neither done nor advocated violence. And even with that limited definition, it finds that there are over 500,000 people in the world who need help. And AI works through a number of mechanisms. The most important are letter writing, and you might say, well, what good is letter writing? But the statistics show that it's quite successful. For example, in regard to urgent actions, that is, cases involving torture, the data in 76 and 77 show that in about 25% of the cases, the individual is released after the letters are written, and the government official gets thousands of letters from all over the world about this particular prisoner. And you might say, well, why release? And particularly because the letters usually don't ask about for release. They usually ask to stop torture, or to give medical care, or to allow legal lawyers into the prison or whatever. And the answer is that the governments just get very nervous about having letters written to them, particularly thousands of letters and telegrams. And also because I've been told by one diplomat that we have what's called a 6 centimeter rule in our country. Well, 6 centimeters is a fairly large amount. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And their answer is, well, when the dossier gets to 6 centimeters wide, we let them out. And so they don't read the letters, they just sort of put them in the file, and it gets big enough to let them out. But in addition, to about that, there's about 23% of the cases in which they either release them, or then the next 23%, they do what the letters say. They give the medical care, they stop the torture, they stop the political execution, whatever. So about half the cases, there are some good results. In another quarter of the cases, there's information that is obtained. And that's also a success, because it's difficult to get information in many of these cases. And 20% of the cases, no further information is found, and in 5% of the cases, the person is found dead in the street. The torture continues, the execution occurs, the bad result occurs. But still, I think that if it's, it's counterintuitive for me that just writing letters would do that well in 50% of the cases. Now, AI has tried to use these techniques in regard to terrorism. It tried to use it in the Aldo Moro case, and it's beginning to experiment with cases in which terrorist organizations are the people to whom we address these urgent actions. Aldo Moro, as you know, died, so in that case, we didn't succeed. And it is harder, and there's no doubt it's harder in terrorist organizations. Who do you write to? I mean, is there an address? And also, to what extent do they rely on the good impressions of people about them, as governments must do? And again, there's some questions about whether the techniques will really work. But we're beginning to experiment with using those techniques as to non-governmental violence by terrorist organizations. The other technique which is important and which I want to talk to you about before I stop, and that is the technique of adoption groups. Because if these urgent actions are not appropriate or they've been used, the next technique is for Amnesty International to determine that an individual is a prisoner of conscience, and then the cases are taken and distributed in a more or less even-handed way to about 2,000 groups around the world. And there's one group here in Ames. There are various groups. I mean, one of them is all retired nuns in Connecticut. There's a nice little group there. And then I helped help form a group of lawyers and prosecutors in Milwaukee. And they have a group there. And they're very different, each group. It depends on who's there and who's in the area. But what they all do essentially is to write letter after letter after letter to every government official you can think of, asking for the release of the individual, and send aid to the prisoner, and send letters of support to the family, and do whatever is necessary to get these individuals out in a peaceful way, and it's rewarding work. I remember vividly, I've worked for the release of now about 12 people, and of which about 8 have been released. Amnesty International figures that each year, each group releases about 3/4 of a prisoner. Hopefully we get out the whole prisoner, but it takes a little longer than a year. But one particular prisoner I remember, a prisoner from East Germany actually, wrote us a letter. His name was Ernst Wilhelm, and he was a young physics student who had protested against the Russian-Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And he wrote to us a letter after he had been bought out by the German government's very enlightened program of helping to obtain the release of East Germans to come to the West. And he wrote us a letter saying, "I write you, Mr. Weisbrot, for the first time as a free man." And it's to receive letters like that that Amnesty International works. Thank you.
He said also that Amnesty International figures that about 500,000 people in the world whom you are looking for, whom you care for, because they have been in prison for political reasons without advocating violence. Now, how many of these million people live in West Germany? You mentioned 3 times a certain country in Europe, and of course everybody knows here that this was Germany. And let me just answer to these 3 statements. But before I would like to say something, I found myself a little bit in an awkward position, because you spoke about terrorism in a way which I think in German we don't. Maybe in English it's different. We have a clear distinction in Germany between terror and terrorism. I was asked to speak about terrorism, but you meant terror. Maybe in English it's different. In Germany it's like that. Terrorism is made by non-governmental forces. Terror is made by government forces. Therefore, I refrain from mentioning terror. Now, these 3 points you mentioned were the so-called Berufsverbot, which is indeed wrongly understood. Even you understood it wrongly, because you mentioned a garbage collector. That no garbage collector ever had been forbidden to work in Germany on account of his political conviction, but you are right. There was a talk about one railway engine driver, which I find as stupid as to forbid him to work because he's a communist. Now, I tried in my speech to give you certain reasons for state action. We have not always been very wise in